Morning with somebody who is really important to the state of Missouri and really important to education and public education in the state of Missouri. I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker. Charlie Shields serves as President and Chief Executive Officer of Truman Medical Centers. Charlie brings to the role more than 25 years of healthcare leadership and decades of public service, including 20 years in the Missouri General Assembly, culminating his service with 2 years as President Pro Tem of the Missouri Senate. He was appointed to the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education State Board of Education by Governor Jay Nixon in August 2012, and he's completed a 2-year term as our State Board of Education President. So if you'd give me a nice, warm welcome for Charlie Shields.
Thanks, Doug. It is absolutely wonderful to be with you. This kind of reminds me a little bit of church. Nobody's in the front pews. Those that need it the most are sitting in the back. But it's a great time to be here. So Doug asked me to discuss a few things, the landscape around public education, where I think we need to head as a state and the role of charters. And as Doug mentioned, a little background on myself, I have the great honor of serving as the president of the State Board of Education. I also served on a local school board for 16 years, spent 20 years in the state legislature, and finished as the president pro tem of the Missouri Senate. And I, in my current role, am extremely fortunate and have the honor of leading Truman Medical Center. So if you walk out the front of the Marriott and look just to the south, you will see Truman. And we are Kansas City's academic medical center for the University of Missouri, Kansas City. But we're also very much a safety net hospital. We treat the most vulnerable citizens in this community. People ask me, you're a hospital CEO, why do you care about education? You know, what got you involved in this? Why are you president and serve on the state board? And to me, it's always been a relatively simple to understand the connection between health and education, because if you look at the health status of an individual, the number one determinant of your health status is your economic status. That is what determines your level of health. That's the highest correlation. Take it just one step further. What is the number one determinant of your economic status? It is your level of education. So it seems perfectly normal to me that a hospital executive should be involved in education. I also want to give you a little background on the State Board of Education. So a lot of people, we tend to be a fairly misunderstood body. We have 8 members. We are set up in the Constitution. We are geographically and politically dispersed. We have no more than 1 member from each congressional district. We have no more than half our members from any one political board or political party. So on the board, I said we have 8. We currently have 1 vacancy representing the 7th district, which is down in southwest Missouri. Our job is to provide a framework for public education in our state, and that includes academic standards, assessment requirements, certification of educators, and really setting goals for public education in our state. The one thing that is unique in Missouri is that the State Board of Education is created in the Constitution, has a separate article in the Constitution, Article 9 in the Constitution, and serves somewhat independent of the other state departments and independent of the governor's office. And that's atypical for most departments in the state who report directly to the governor's office. The state board, we establish 4 really broad goals in terms of what we're trying to do and how we move education forward in our state. Goal number 1, which is incredibly significant and the topic of most of our discussions, is every student graduates college and career readiness. And I'm going to talk about that a little more in my remarks. Goal number 2 is that all Missouri children enter kindergarten prepared to be successful in school. And I think we are beginning finally to make some progress around early childhood education. Goal 3 is Missouri will prepare and develop and support effective educators, and there are so many great teachers in this room We know that that absolutely is the key to this. And then the last goal is that we'll be operationally efficient. We know that we have limited resources in the state, and we need to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. So with that background on me and that background on the state board, let's do a little deeper dive and talk about education in our state. When people typically gather in conferences like this, the discussion is always around public education in Missouri, the state of public education in Missouri, the state of public education in the country, and the challenges that we all face. There's a challenge of funding, so funding on the public side, but also particularly on charters, funding from the private side. The work you do is really expensive, and there's never enough money. We talk about assessments and this increased focus on assessments that we have in our state and nation, and we know that sometimes as educators it seems like all you're doing is being involved in the assessment process. We know that there are challenging socioeconomic factors that affect our students. The students you see every day, they come from backgrounds that are very different than some of the backgrounds that we grew up with, and that is challenging for you and for those students. Many times the school is the only place of refuge. We struggle sometimes with a legislature that doesn't always understand public education, and I was one of those people. I always point out it's not their fault, because they're talking about education one day, but they're talking about mental health, they're talking about economic development, they're talking about crimes and punishment. So education is just part of what's on their plate. And then I will look inward and say, one of your challenges sometimes is the State Board of Education, because we ask a lot of you, and there's a lot of information you have to provide to the department. So you face those challenges every day. But I want to broaden the discussion past the challenges facing education and talk about the challenges that actually face our state and how to meet the challenges facing our state. Ultimately, the answer resides in education and the work that you do every day. So talk about Missouri and what are our challenges and how do we stack up compared to other states in our nation. Well, most people focus on economic prosperity and opportunity for their state's citizens and quality of life, educational opportunities, health status, ability of one generation to succeed better than the other generation, the previous generation. Those are what generally are accepted as making one state better, more livable than the next state. It's what makes a great state, all those factors. And the truth, and sometimes it hurts, but when you look at national rankings, in most national rankings, Missouri is frankly at the middle of the pack on that. And in some cases, we're not quite to the middle. We're in the lower third of the pack. So we rank 36 in median family income. In health status, which I talked about earlier, we are 38th in the nation. We're not a particularly healthy state. And if you know you have these challenges, and you know we're at the middle of the pack, the question is, as a state, are you destined to stay at the middle of the pack? Are there things that you just can't change that will always hold Missouri back? And I think the absolute answer to that is no. We can change these things, and we can move Missouri forward. We have an incredible array of advantages as a state. Our geography works to our advantage. I mean, we are at the center of the nation. We are at the crossroads. You're in Kansas City today. I mean, this is a rail transportation hub for our nation. Missouri is incredibly rich in natural resources. We have in Missouri a vibrant tourism economy. We are the place people want to visit. Our tax structure in this state is by no means anti-business. We have a favorable tax structure. We have a great agricultural economy. We feed the rest of the nation and feed the rest of the world. We don't lack for public colleges and universities. We have 13 public colleges and universities in this state. And we have a high-quality healthcare system in this state. We bring more healthcare dollars from our surrounding states than we export. So the fact is, if you look at all those advantages, Missouri absolutely can be one of the top 10 states in our nation in terms of quality of life. We have so many advantages. We have no structural disadvantages. So what keeps us there, and what is holding us back? What does it take to be a top 10 nation, and how do we get there? Well, Doug mentioned, and I also mentioned in my background, I was a politician for 20 years. I tell people I'm a recovering politician, but I was a politician for 20 years. And next year is an election year in Missouri, and those are important things. And I've watched this long enough. We have an entire House of Representatives. We have half the Senate. We have a U.S. Senate race. We have a lot of people running for office. And people will give you ideas, and they will campaign. And I can tell you what the campaign issues people will talk about next year in the campaign. That we need to create a better tax climate for Missouri business. That we'll have the debate about whether Missouri needs to be a right-to-work state or doesn't need to be a right-to-work state. We talk about rewriting the tax code. People say we have a broken tax code. We need to rewrite the tax code. A lot of discussion in D.C. about that. In health care, it's always about do we expand Medicaid or we don't expand Medicaid. We need to get tough on crime. We need less government or we need more government, depending on which side you're on. The one that always amuses me, if anybody does talk about education campaign, we need to get rid of Common Core. Well, we put the stake in the heart of Common Core 2 years ago in Missouri, but it's still an issue. People think we're still living with Common Core. Government needs to run like a business. So, I mean, those are the issues that you will hear in campaigns next year, and the thing that always frustrates me is you don't hear a lot of talk about education when it comes to campaigns. And what I think all those issues I mentioned are incredibly important. Okay, I mean they're good stuff, but not one of those, and not even the collection of all of those, will move Missouri to becoming a top 10 state, which we're all trying to do. We will only get to be a top 10 state if we accomplish one thing, and that one thing is increasing the level of educational attainment of our citizens. The correlation between economic prosperity of a state, the quality of life of a state, and the level of education of its citizens is indisputable. So why do I think this should be the focus? Why do I think this is something politicians should be talking about? Well, the United States for years has led the world in being the most successful and prosperous nation in the world because typically our people and our citizens have been the most educated people in the world. So Americans of my generation, so I'm 58, so I'm at the end of the baby boomers, but Americans of my generation were the most educated in the world. Okay, if you look at educational attainment from people my age across all the developed countries, we are the most educated in the world. But for our young people, that is no longer the case. So I read a lot of the work of the Lumina Foundation, which is out of Indianapolis, and they talk a lot about educational attainment. But if you read the Lumina Foundation's work, the United States now ranks 11th among industrialized nations in the percentage of young adults with college degrees. So my generation, we led the world, but our young people were 11th in the world. And while the United States ranks 11th in the world, Missouri ranks 39th in the nation, and we're behind, and this one really hurts me to say it, we're behind Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois. We are slightly ahead, thank God, of Arkansas. But if you look at counties in our states in level of educational attainment, we have counties that have educational attainment levels below that of Mexico. And I think that's a concern. So given that we have to improve educational attainment, that's our challenge to get to become a top 10 state in our nation. What role do charters play in that, and what should the discussion be? So I was in the legislature in the late 90s when we created Missouri's charter school law. And the history on that is we did that to create alternatives in Kansas City and St. Louis who had failing urban school districts. Now, obviously, there's been progress made in those two school districts, but that was the big reason. And the idea behind charters was to bring education and freedom, or innovation and freedom to education. That charters would be free of excessive regulation from the state. They would be easy to start, and if they weren't performing, they would be easy to fold. And the other piece of that was they would bring other resources, private resources, to the equation to improve education in those two cities. We have 39 charter schools, I think it was my last count, LEAs in the state of Missouri, and we have a number of different sponsoring organizations, including one sponsored by a school district, Kansas City Neighborhood Academy, which my hospital partners with and we're very proud of. And then we have another sponsored by the Charter Commission in our state, and the rest are all sponsored by higher education institutions. If I can characterize the discussion for the past 20 years since we created that law in the late 90s around charter schools, the discussion gets kind of frustrating because when you talk to policymakers, are you either pro-charter or pro-traditional schools? Are you either for charter expansion or you are against charter expansion? We have highly successful charters, and some hold those out to the model, but we have some that continue to struggle, and we have charters that have closed. And some of those have closed under difficult circumstances. We have some sponsors that do a fabulous job with the charter schools, and we have some, and thankfully they're not sponsors anymore, that really didn't fulfill their obligation and their responsibility as sponsors. And I think as somebody who has always been around public education and been around the legislature, what is frustrating is that in the last 20 years, we have not evolved that conversation. And because we have not evolved the conversation, we haven't realized the full potential of charter schools in our state. And I think all that discussion that happens out there, I think it puts the policymakers in Jeff City in a really difficult position. Last week, I had the opportunity to be in Boston. And Boston is a really